The air in the Black Hawk County Co-op office in the fall of '74 was thick with the smell of seed dust, stale coffee, and unbridled optimism. It was a Saturday morning, and the place was packed with farmers settling up accounts, talking yields, and lying about how early they'd gotten their beans out. Frank Miller stood by the counter, waiting for Old Man Hemmings to finish hand-tallying his receipt. Frank was a quiet man, built like a fence post, lean, weathered, and not prone to bending. His hands, resting on the worn Formica countertop, were a road map of his life's work. Scarred knuckles, calloused palms, and fingernails permanently underlined with the rich, black Iowa soil he worked. The booming voice of Dale Peterson cut through the low hum of conversation like a new disc through fallow ground. Dale was everything Frank was not. He was 10 years younger, 20 pounds heavier around the middle, and his confidence was as big and shiny as the new equipment he was always bragging about. "Heard you boys talking about horsepower," Dale bellowed, slapping a farmer named Gus on the back, hard enough to make him spill his coffee. A circle of men, most of them in their 30s and 40s, turned to listen. Dale was the future, they all thought, the man who was figuring this new way of farming out. I tell you what, that new International 1466 I got, she's a whole different animal. Put the 12-foot chisel plow on her yesterday, dropped it in deep, and she just walked with it. Didn't even grunt. The turbo sounds like a jet taking off. Heads nodded in admiration. They'd all seen it parked in front of the dealership, a monster of red iron with dual rear wheels, a factory cab with tinted glass, air conditioning, and a radio. It was a palace on wheels compared to the open station tractors most of them grew up on. Dale's eyes scanned the room, landing on Frank. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. "Frank," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You ought to trade in that old 4020 of yours. Saw it parked outside. Hell, I think the tires are older than I am." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Frank's John Deere 4020 was a legend in the county. Bought new by his father in '68, it was one of the last of the good ones before they changed the design. It had the classic looks, the reliable synchro-range transmission, and an engine that just wouldn't quit. Frank knew every bolt on that machine. It was paid for, had been for years. Frank turned slowly, his face unreadable. "She runs fine, Dale." "Runs fine?" Dale laughed, a loud, dismissive bark. "Frank, this is 1974. We're feeding the world. Russia's buying every bushel we can grow. You can't feed the world with 100 horsepower and a prayer. I just picked up the lease on the old Henderson place. Another 240 acres. You think I could work that ground with your little green toy? The bank is practically begging us to take their money. You gotta expand, man. Get big or get out." The phrase hung in the air. It was the new gospel, preached from the pages of Farm Journal and spoken by the slick-suited bankers who were suddenly every farmer's best friend. Get big or get out. Gus, wiping coffee from his shirt, chimed in. "He's right, Frank. I just traded my 1066 for a 14-in-66, just like Dale's. The payments are steep, but with corn at $3, who cares?" "It's not about the payments," Dale said, puffing out his chest. "It's about investment. It's about depreciation. It's a write-off. You're leaving money on the table, fooling around with that old junk." He pointed a thick finger out the window at Frank's tractor. The green paint was faded on the hood from 30,000 hours under the Iowa sun, and there was a dark stain of old diesel on the side where the fuel cap had a slow leak Frank hadn't gotten around to fixing. Next to it, another farmer's brand-new Case Agri-King looked like a spaceship. Frank just gave a slight nod. "She's paid for, Dale. That's all the investment I need." The laughter this time was genuine, The whole room seemed to join in. Paid for. The word sounded ancient, foolish. Who cared if it was paid for when you could borrow money at 7% and make a 30% return on your crop? It was simple math. Frank Miller, they all thought, was stuck in his father's generation. A good man, a hard worker, but a man who was going to be left behind, a fossil preserved in his own stubbornness. Frank took his receipt from Mr. Hemmings, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He walked out of the co-op without another word, the sound of their laughter following him into the crisp autumn air. He swung himself up onto the familiar black seat of the 4020. The vinyl was cracked, but it was shaped to him. He pushed the throttle forward, turned the key, and the 6-cylinder diesel engine roared to life with a familiar, throaty rumble. There was no turbo whine, just the honest clatter of solid steel and controlled combustion. He let it warm for a minute, the smell of its exhaust a comforting perfume. He looked at his reflection in the dusty glass of the co-op window, saw the men still watching him, still smiling. He pushed in the clutch, pulled the gear shift into 6th, and drove away. Before we get any further into this story, I have to stop and ask you folks listening. Have you ever been in Frank's shoes? Have you ever been the one sticking to the tried and true, being careful with your money, while everyone around you was chasing the new, shiny thing and making you feel like a fool for it? Maybe it was with a car, a house, or a business. Drop a comment and let me know, because Frank Miller knew that feeling in his bones, and he was about to live with it every single day. He drove the 5 miles back to his farm, the steady rhythm of the tractor, a balm to his spirit. The Miller farm wasn't flashy, just 160 acres of the best black dirt God ever made, a modest white farmhouse his grandfather had built, a solid red barn, and a machine shed. Everything was neat. The fences were tight, the grass was mowed, and there wasn't a piece of junk equipment rusting in the weeds. His father had taught him that. A man's farm is a reflection of his character, Frank. Keep it clean, keep it honest, and keep it yours. The most important lesson, though, had been about debt. His father had farmed through the Depression. He'd seen neighbors, good men, lose everything because of a note at the bank. He'd hammered it into Frank's head from the time he was a boy. Never borrow for what you can't pay for in a year, he'd say. And never ever bet the land. The land is all you've really got. If you don't own it, son, it owns you. Frank had taken that to heart. When his father passed 10 years ago, there was still a small mortgage on the farm. Frank and his wife, Mary, had lived frugally, driving old cars, taking no fancy vacations, and pouring every spare dollar into that note. 5 years ago, he'd made the final payment. He remembered holding the deed, free and clear, in his hands. It was the proudest moment of his life. He owned this place. Every square inch. It was a feeling Dale Peterson, with his mountain of debt, would never understand. But pride didn't plow the fields any faster. As the years went on, Frank's carefulness began to look more and more like poverty. While his neighbors bought new 4-wheel drive tractors, he kept the 40-20 running. While they bought new Gleaner combines with air-conditioned cabs, he sweated through the harvest in his old Alice Chalmers All-Crop 66, a simple, reliable machine that was slow as molasses, but easy to fix. The next spring, in 75, the scorn he felt at the co-op began to manifest in more concrete ways. He was out in the field, turning over the corn stubble, when he heard a telltale whine from the 40-20. It was faint at first, a high-pitched hum that changed with the engine's RPMs. Frank's heart sank. He knew that sound. It was the main hydraulic pump, the heart of the tractor, the very thing that made a John Deere a John Deere. It powered the steering, the brakes, and the three-point hitch. When it went, you were dead in the water. He limped the tractor back to the machine shed, the steering getting heavier with every turn of the wheel. Dale Peterson drove by on the road in his pickup, a brand-new Ford F-250, and gave Frank a little toot of the horn and a wave that felt more like a salute to a fallen soldier. For Dale, a problem like this was simple. He'd call the dealership, they'd send out a service truck with a new pump, and he'd be running again in a day, the bill just another line item to be financed. For Frank, it was a different story. A new pump was over $500. That was money he didn't have just lying around, not with seed and fertilizer costs going up every year. There was only one option: fix it himself. He spent the rest of the day getting ready. First, he drained the 16 gallons of high-guard transmission fluid into clean 5-gallon buckets, the warm, honey-colored oil smelling of work and steel. Then came the hard part. The pump was buried deep in the tractor's cast-iron belly. He had to split the tractor. He used his engine hoist to support the front end, then laid on the cold concrete floor, unbolting the massive bolts that held the engine and clutch housing to the transmission case. The wrench was 3 feet long, and it took all of his weight, grunting and straining, to break the bolts free. Slowly, carefully, he rolled the front half of the tractor forward, exposing the guts of the machine. There it was, the hydraulic pump, a complex piece of machinery tucked away behind the flywheel. It took him another 2 hours of wrestling with lines and linkages in the cramped space to finally get it free. He carried the pump, a heavy, grease-coated lump of iron, to his workbench. It felt like carrying a sick child. He tore it down meticulously, laying each part out on a clean rag in the order it came off. He knew what he was looking for. And there it was. One of the stroking pistons was deeply scored, with gouges you could catch a fingernail on. A tiny piece of metal must have gotten into the system and chewed it up. The pump was shot. The next morning, he was on the phone. The local dealer confirmed the price for a new one, and then offered to sell him a new tractor with an easy financing plan. Frank politely declined. He called a salvage yard over in Waterloo. "Yeah, got a 40-220 here, we're parting out," the gruff voice on the other end said. "Pump's still in it. $100 if you pull it yourself." Frank spent the day driving his old Chevy pickup the 60 miles to the salvage yard. It was a graveyard of farm equipment, rows upon rows of rusting machines, their parts cannibalized, their working lives over. He found the dead 40-120, its tires gone, its engine block cracked by frozen water. It was a sad sight. He spent 3 hours lying in the mud and grease, fighting with rusted bolts to get the pump out. It was a gamble. There was no guarantee this one was any good, but it was a gamble he had to take. Back in his own shop, he tore the salvaged pump down, too. It was better. No deep scores. He used the best parts from both pumps to build one good one, carefully cleaning every piece in solvent, checking the tolerances with a micrometer, and replacing all the seals and O-rings from a kit he'd bought. He lapped the valve plate on a piece of glass with fine grit compound until it was perfectly flat. It was slow, painstaking work. His hands were stained black with grease, and his back ached from leaning over the bench. While Frank worked, life in the township went on. The weather was perfect for planting, and the sound of powerful new tractors running day and night filled the air. Dale Peterson had his corn in the ground in 3 days flat, his big 24-foot planter covering ground at a phenomenal rate. Farmers would slow down as they passed Frank's place, seeing his tractor still split in two in the shed. The talk at the diner was grim. Poor Frank. He's going to miss his planting window. That old junk is finally catching up to him. They weren't mean-spirited. Not really. It was a kind of pity. the kind you feel for someone who just can't or won't keep up. After 4 long days of work, Frank had the rebuilt pump back together. He wrestled it back into the tractor, bolted the machine back together, and poured the filtered high-guard fluid back in. He climbed into the seat, his stomach in a knot. This had to work. He turned the key. The engine fired up, and for a moment, the hydraulic whine was still there, loud as ever. His heart sank. Then, as the air bled out of the system, the noise faded, replaced by the quiet, powerful hum of a healthy pump. He turned the steering wheel. It was smooth as butter. He raised and lowered the 3-point hitch. It moved perfectly. A wave of relief washed over him, so powerful it almost made him dizzy. He had done it. He had saved himself $500. But more than that, he had won. He had faced a breakdown that would have sent other men to the bank, and he had beaten it with his own 2 hands and $100 part. He was a week behind in his planting, but he knew he could make it up. He'd work longer hours, push a little harder. That summer, a brutal hailstorm swept through the county. It cut a narrow path, and Frank's farm was right in the middle of it. The storm shredded the leaves on his corn and battered his soybean plants. It wasn't a total loss, but it knocked a good 30% off his yield potential. He walked the fields afterward, picking up the ice stones that were still littered between the rows, feeling the cold knot of worry tighten in his gut. Dale's farm, 2 miles to the north, was barely touched. At the co-op a week later, Dale was talking about it. Yeah, we got a little hail, but it wasn't bad. Anyway, that's what crop insurance is for. You got insurance, right, Frank? Frank shook his head. Couldn't afford it this year. Dale just shook his head, a look of pity on his face. See, that's what I'm talking about. You got to spend money to make money, trying to save a few bucks on insurance. And now look, you'll be lucky to break even. Frank didn't say anything. He knew Dale was right, in a way. The lost income from the hail damage hurt. It meant there would be no new tires for the pickup this year, and Mary would have to keep patching his work jeans. It was another setback, another year of just getting by. But as he looked at Dale, he saw the man's new diamond ring, heard him talking about the vacation to Florida he was planning for the winter, and he saw the invisible chains of debt that made it all possible. Frank was poor, maybe, but he was free. He wasn't sure Dale could say the same. The years from 1975 to 1978 were a golden age for American agriculture. It seemed like the music would never stop. Grain prices stayed high, fueled by massive exports and a weak dollar. Land values went insane. Ground that sold for $500 an acre in 1970 was now fetching $2,000, then $3,000. It was a frenzy. Farmers were using the inflated value of their land as collateral to borrow staggering amounts of money, buying more land and bigger equipment. The mantra of "get big or get out" was now screamed from every corner. Inflation was creeping up across the country, but for farmers, it just meant the price of their corn and beans went up too. It felt like a perpetual motion machine of prosperity. Dale Peterson was the poster boy for the boom. He was no longer just a farmer. He was an agricultural tycoon, at least in his own mind. He bought the 240 acres he'd been leasing from the Henderson estate, paying a price that made old-timers gasp. He didn't blink. "Land is the one thing they're not making any more of," he'd say, parroting a line he'd read in a magazine. The ink was barely dry on that deed when he bought another 160 acres that bordered his property to the south. In 4 years, he had gone from farming 300 acres to over 700. His equipment fleet expanded to match. The 14 i6, which had been the talk of the county, was traded in for a massive articulated Steiger Panther, a four-wheel drive behemoth that could pull a 50-foot field cultivator. He bought a new John Deere 7700 Turbo combine, a gleaming giant with a 6-row corn head. He built a new grain leg and a 100,000-bushel drying bin. All of it, every last bolt, was financed. The local banker loved him. Dale was a man of vision, a progressive operator. Frank Miller, meanwhile, was seen as a man with no vision at all. He stuck to his 160 acres. He watched the land around him get snapped up at astronomical prices and just shook his head. He couldn't make the numbers work. How could you possibly pay a $3,000 an acre mortgage with $3 corn? It didn't make sense. The profits he made during those good years, and they were good years even for him, didn't go into new iron. They went into his farm. He finally saved up enough cash to put up a new machine shed, a sturdy pole building he designed himself. He didn't hire a crew. He and his neighbor, an old-timer named Ben, who shared his skepticism of the new ways, put it up themselves over the course of a summer. They set the poles, wrestled the trusses into place, and screwed down every sheet of steel with their own hands. When it was done, Frank stood back and looked at the building, gleaming in the sun, and felt a satisfaction deeper than any loan approval could provide. He owned it. His old all-Chalmers combine was starting to show its age. The engine was getting tired, burning a little oil. Instead of trading it in for a pittance and taking on a $20,000 loan for a new one, Frank spent the winter in his shop rebuilding the engine. He pulled the block, had the cylinders bored, and put in new pistons, rings and bearings. He ground the valves. He rebuilt the carburetor. It was tedious, greasy work, but by spring, the old machine ran better than it had in years. The community saw all of this not as prudence, but as failure. They saw him working on his old equipment and thought he was too broke to upgrade. They saw him building his own shed and thought he was too cheap to hire a contractor. The gap between him and Dale had become a chasm. Dale drove a new Cadillac. Frank still drove his 15-year-old Chevy. Dale's wife had a new wardrobe every season. Mary still used a sewing machine to make dresses for their daughter. At church potlucks, people would pat Frank on the shoulder and say, "Hang in there, Frank. Times are tough." They had no idea that by the fall of 1978, Frank Miller was the only farmer in the county under the age of 60 who was completely, 100% debt-free. The harvest of 79 was a bin-buster. The weather had been perfect all year, and the yields were staggering. Everyone was flush with cash and optimism. Dale threw a huge harvest party in his new machine shed, with a hired band and catered food. He was on top of the world, a king surveying his empire of black dirt and borrowed money. Frank didn't go. That November, Frank was in his barn, servicing the Fortis 20 for the winter. He had the radio on, tuned to the big AM station out of Des Moines. A news report came on. The announcer's voice was serious. He was talking about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. He was talking about a war on inflation and something called the prime interest rate. The rate, the announcer said, had just jumped to 15%. Frank stopped what he was doing, a filter wrench in his hand. 15%. He remembered his father telling him about loan sharks in the old days. It sounded like something from a different world. He finished his work, the familiar routine, a comfort in the face of the unsettling news. He wiped the last of the grease from the tractor's hood and started the engine, letting it run for a few minutes to circulate the clean oil. The old diesel settled into a smooth, steady idle, a sound of reliability, of endurance. He shut it off and stood for a moment in the quiet of the barn, the smell of hay and old iron filling his senses. Through the open barn door, he could see the lights on at Dale Peterson's place, 2 miles down the road. They were bright, powerful halogen lights, illuminating a massive operation that ran late into the night. Even from this distance, Frank could hear the faint hum of the fans on Dale's new grain dryer, a constant, voracious roar, consuming electricity and propane, drying corn that had been harvested with borrowed equipment to pay off borrowed money. A cold wind rattled the tin on the barn roof, a harbinger of the coming winter. Frank shivered, and it had nothing to do with the temperature. The harvest of '79 was a bumper crop for everyone. But Frank Miller had a feeling that something else had been sown in the fields of Black Hawk County, and the harvest would be a bitter one indeed. The winter of 1980 arrived with a vengeance, not just in the weather but on the airwaves. In January, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. For the American farmer, who had been promised a bottomless market for their crops, it was like a door slamming shut in their face. The price of corn, which had been holding steady over $3 a bushel, collapsed almost overnight. It plunged to $2.50, then $2.20. The foundation of the agricultural boom had cracked. At the Black Hawk County Co-op, the mood was no longer boisterous. The talk of new tractors and record yields was replaced by hushed, worried conversations about the embargo and the prime interest rate, which was now climbing past 16, then 17%. The variable rate operating loans that every farmer except Frank had taken out were suddenly ticking time bombs. A 7% loan was now a 17% loan. The payments on a $100,000 note didn't just go up, they doubled, then tripled. Frank felt the pinch like everyone else. The low price for his 1979 corn crop meant his modest profit margin was erased. But that was all he lost, his profit. He had no loan payments to make. He sold just enough corn to pay his property taxes and buy seed for the spring, storing the rest in his old wooden crib, hoping for a better price down the road. It was a luxury no one else had. His neighbors had to sell, dumping their entire crop on the collapsed market just to generate enough cash flow to satisfy the bankers for another month. Spring planting that year was a tense affair. The roar of big diesel engines still filled the air, but it was a sound laced with desperation. Dale Peterson was pushing harder than anyone. He was farming nearly 800 acres now, and the interest on his debt was accruing at a terrifying rate. He ran his big Steiger Panther day and night, the cab lights glowing across the fields like a lost ship on a dark sea. One afternoon in early May, Frank was out in his own field, pulling his 6-row John Deere planter with the 40-20. The old tractor chugged along at a steady 4 miles an hour, dropping seeds into the rich, black earth. He heard the Steiger working in the field next to him, the deep thrum of its big caterpillar engine, a constant presence. Then, suddenly, the thrum was gone. Frank looked over and saw the massive green tractor sitting motionless in the middle of the field. He finished his row and drove over. Dale was standing beside the tractor, kicking one of the giant dual tires, his face a mask of fury and panic. "What's the trouble, Dale?" Frank asked, throttling the 40-20 down to an idle. "The transmission!" Dale spat, not even looking at him. "Just quit. Put it in gear and nothing. It's the power shift. Made a hell of a grinding noise, and that was it." Frank nodded slowly. He didn't know much about those complex transmissions, but he knew they weren't something you fixed with a wrench and a pry bar. "You called the dealer?" "Yeah," Dale said, his voice cracking. "They can't get a man out here till tomorrow. Said it sounds like the clutch packs are shot. $10,000, he said. Might be 12, and they'll have to haul it to their shop in Waterloo. I'll be down for a week, maybe 2. I've still got 400 acres of corn to get in the ground, Frank." Dale finally looked at Frank, and for the first time, Frank saw not arrogance, but raw fear in the man's eyes. The swagger was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of his empire. A $10,000 repair bill, a 2-week delay in planting. A year ago, it would have been an annoyance. Now, with ruinous interest rates and collapsed prices, it was a potential death blow. "There's a storm front coming through this weekend, too," Dale whispered, looking at the sky as if it were a personal enemy. "If I don't get this corn in—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Frank sat on his tractor for a long moment, the steady, familiar idle of its engine a stark contrast to the dead silence of the Steiger. He thought of the laughter in the co-op, the years of being looked down upon. A part of him, a small, dark part, wanted to just drive away to say, "That's what you get for buying that newfangled junk." But that wasn't his father's way. It wasn't his way. "I'll be done planting my corn tomorrow afternoon," Frank said, his voice even. "My planter's only a 6-row, and that old 4020 won't set any speed records. But if you've got the seed and the fuel, I can come over and start on your ground. It's better than nothing." Dale stared at him, his mouth slightly open. He looked from Frank's small, simple rig to his own paralyzed monster. The humiliation was plain on his face, but it was overwhelmed by the desperation. "You'd do that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Frank just nodded. "Neighbors are supposed to help neighbors. We'll settle up when you're back on your feet." For the next week, Frank Miller became a fixture on Dale Peterson's farm. After finishing his own planting, he drove the 4020 over and started working Dale's massive fields. It was a strange sight, the little green tractor, dwarfed by the landscape, chugging away, planting 6 rows at a time on a farm geared for 24. It was slow, tedious work. Frank ran from sunup until well after sundown, the tractor's simple headlights cutting a small path through the darkness. Mary brought him sandwiches and a thermos of coffee for supper in the field. Dale, his own machine still gone, would sometimes just stand at the edge of the field and watch, a silent, humbled figure. Frank never said a word about it. He just climbed on the 4020 every morning and went to work, the reliable rhythm of the old diesel, a steady heartbeat in a world that was coming apart. By 1982, the crisis was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was a flood sweeping through the heartland. Interest rates peaked at an unimaginable 21%. Commodity prices stayed in the gutter, and land values, the paper wealth that had backed the entire pyramid of debt, collapsed. Land that had been worth $3,000 an acre was now unsellable at $1,500. Farmers who had borrowed 80% against their net worth suddenly owed more than their entire farm was worth. The signs were everywhere. Hand-painted auction signs bloomed along the county roads like bitter weeds. The local paper was filled with foreclosure notices. The chatter at the diner was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. Men who had been proud and confident now looked haunted, their eyes filled with a terror that Frank recognized from his father's stories of the Depression. It was the terror of losing not just a business, but a home, a history, an identity. Frank and Mary survived. They weren't prospering, not by any means. They were just getting by, same as always. But in the new reality, just getting by was a monumental victory. Their cost of living was low. Their farm was self-sufficient in many ways. Mary's garden provided most of their food, and Frank's ability to fix his own equipment meant his operating costs were a fraction of his neighbors'. The money they had saved during the good years, the money they hadn't spent on new Cadillacs or trips to Florida, was now their shield. While the storm raged around them, their small, debt-free farm was an island of stability. The day of Dale Peterson's auction was cold and grey for late March. A bitter wind whipped across the farmstead, carrying the funereal tones of the auctioneer's chant. Nearly the whole county was there, not to find bargains, but to bear witness. They stood in clusters, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. It was like attending a wake. This could be any one of them next month, or the month after. Frank stood near the back, watching as Dale's life was sold off, piece by piece. The Steiger Panther, its transmission finally repaired, sold for less than half what Dale had paid for it. The big John Deere 7700 combine went for a fraction of its value. The tools from his shop, the grain trucks, the household furniture, it all went under the hammer. Frank watched Dale's wife, her face pale and drawn, leading their 2 young children back to the house, trying to shield them from the spectacle of their family's ruin. Dale himself stood beside the auctioneer's truck, a hollowed-out version of the man he once was. The confidence was gone, the booming voice was silent. He just stared into the distance, his expression blank, as the banker, a man in a sharp suit who had once slapped him on the back and called him a visionary, stood nearby with a clipboard, ticking off the assets. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the last and most important item. All right, folks, now we're offering the real estate. We'll offer it in 3 parcels. Parcel 1 is the home 80, with the house, bins and buildings. Parcel 2 is the 160 acres to the south, and Parcel 3 is the 240-acre Henderson place. A hush fell over the crowd. This was the final act. This was the land itself. Frank saw Dale flinch, as if struck. The home 80. It had been in his family for 3 generations. The bidding started low. A couple of out-of-state investment groups were there, looking to pick up distressed land on the cheap. The local farmers, most of them struggling themselves, couldn't compete. The price for the home 80 crept up, but it was agonizingly slow. The auctioneer worked the crowd, his voice pleading, cajoling. Frank felt Mary's hand slip into his. He looked at her, and she just nodded. They had talked about it the night before. They had their savings, the money they had so carefully put away. It wasn't a fortune, but in a collapsed market, it was power. When the bidding stalled, Frank raised his hand. His voice was clear and steady. 100,000. It was 20,000 more than the last bid. The crowd turned to look at him, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. Frank Miller, the man who pinched every penny, was making a play for the Peterson homestead. The banker's head snapped up, a flicker of interest in his eyes. The auctioneer's chant regained its energy. I have 100,000. $100,000 from Frank Miller. Do I hear 110? 105? The investment buyers huddled, conferring. They shook their heads. Their calculations were based on return on investment, not on history or community. At that price, it wasn't a bargain anymore. Sold! The auctioneer cried, his hammer falling with a crack that echoed across the silent farmyard. For $100,000 to Frank Miller. Frank didn't feel a sense of triumph. He felt a deep, aching sadness. He walked over to the clerk's table to sign the papers. As he did, Dale approached him, his eyes red-rimmed. Frank, he began, his voice thick with emotion. Why? Frank finished his signature and looked up at the man who had once mocked him. My father always said the land is what matters, Dale. It shouldn't be owned by a company in Chicago. It belongs here. Your name belongs on that mailbox. Dale just stared, unable to speak. I'm not a landlord, Frank continued quietly. I'm a farmer. I'll need someone to work this ground for me. I'll rent it to you. 1/3 of the crop, fair and square. You can stay in the house. You can raise your family here. We'll work something out. Tears welled in Dale's eyes and streamed down his weathered cheeks. He tried to say thank you, but the word caught in his throat. He just reached out, grabbed Frank's calloused hand and shook it, his grip conveying everything he couldn't say. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his ambition, Dale Peterson finally understood the difference between being rich and being wealthy. The farm crisis didn't end overnight. The 80s were a long, hard decade of recovery. But slowly, things began to change. The laughter at Frank Miller's expense had long since died out, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. The phrase "paid for," once a punchline, was now spoken with reverence. It was the motto of the survivors. Younger farmers, the ones just starting out, would stop by Frank's machine shed. They didn't come to talk about horsepower or depreciation. They came for advice. They'd find Frank with his hands covered in grease, usually working on the 4020, which, even by the late 80s, was still his main tractor. He'd wipe his hands on a rag and talk to them, not in grand pronouncements, but in simple, practical terms. He'd show them how to time an injection pump, how to diagnose a hydraulic problem, how to make a part instead of buying one. More importantly, he taught them the lessons his father had taught him. He told them about the danger of letting a banker's ambition become your own. He told them that the goal wasn't to be the biggest farmer, but to be the last one standing. Dale Peterson became Frank's tenant, and in time, his friend. The arrangement worked. Freed from the crushing weight of debt, Dale rediscovered his love for the actual work of farming. He was a good farmer, a hard worker, and with Frank's guidance, he became a careful one. He and Frank would often work together, sharing labor and equipment. Sometimes, on a crisp fall evening, the two men would stand at the fence line between their properties, looking out over the fields, two survivors bound by a shared history of hardship and redemption. One Saturday afternoon, years later, Frank was in the shed with his grandson, a boy of 10 named Sam. The boy was sitting in the seat of the John Deere 4020, his hands on the big steering wheel. The tractor's green paint was almost completely worn off the hood now, faded to a pale pastel by decades of sun. The tires were cracked with age, and the seat was patched with silver duct tape. To an outsider, it looked like a relic, a piece of junk ready for the salvage yard. To Frank, it was beautiful. It was the soundest investment he had ever made. "Grandpa," Sam asked, looking around the cab, "why don't we have a new tractor, like the ones with the computers in them?" Frank smiled and leaned against the big rear tire. He picked up a wrench from his toolbox, its steel worn smooth and dark from a lifetime of use. "Well, Sam," he began, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "let me tell you about this tractor. This tractor doesn't have a computer. It has gears and levers. You can understand it. When it breaks, you can see the broken part. You can hold it in your hand." He tapped the massive cast-iron transmission housing. "But the most important thing about this tractor is that we own it. Nobody can ever take it away from us. It's not just a machine, you see. It's freedom." He went on to tell the boy the story of the 70s and 80s, of the boom and the bust, of neighbors who had lost everything because they had chased a dream that wasn't their own. He told him about Dale, and about the auction, and about the simple power of being beholden to no one. When he was finished, the boy was quiet for a long time, just looking at the old machine with new eyes. Frank reached up and put his hand on his grandson's shoulder. "There's nothing wrong with being big, Sam," he said. "But there's everything wrong with being fragile. Whatever you do in your life, build it on something solid. Build it on something you can fix with your own 2 hands. Build it so you can sleep at night, no matter which way the wind is blowing." He swung himself up into the seat behind his grandson, his movements still sure and practiced. He reached around the boy and turned the key. The old six-cylinder diesel coughed to life with its familiar, throaty roar, the sound of endurance itself. He let Sam steer as they rolled out of the machine shed and into the warm afternoon sun. They drove to the edge of the field, the same field his father and grandfather had worked. The corn was tall and green, stretching all the way to the horizon. Frank looked at his land, his tractor, his grandson. He had never been the richest man in Black Hawk County. He had never had the biggest operation or the newest equipment. But he had the farm. It was still his. The land was still under his feet, free and clear. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was the wealthiest man he had ever known.